It started with a flash, not lightning, but a camera slicing through the fog above Wolf River Harbor on a wet November night. A second later, there was a scream, then the sound of water closing over something heavy, and Memphis went quiet again. By sunrise, a camera washed up in the reeds, lens cracked, film inside ruined, still holding the reflection of the woman who took it. Her name was Naomi Hartwell, 26 years old, a photographer who spent her nights chasing the city's ghosts through empty alleys and forgotten churches. That night she went out chasing a story and became one. The papers called it a disappearance, but the city knew better. They said she saw something she should not have, something that did not want its picture taken. For a week, searchlights swept the river, and then they stopped. The case froze fast. Another folder stamped unresolved. But cold does not mean quiet, not in a city like this, because 26 years later, the same river gave back what it took, and with it, the truth about the man who had spent half his life preaching salvation while hiding a sin no sermon could wash away. If you believe some stories do not stay buried, keep watching, leave a comment with what you think happened to Naomi, and make sure you are subscribed, because this one goes deeper than the river itself. This is Memphis, 1998, the Riverlight Case. Naomi Hartwell's final night began like all the others, with the city humming below her window and the sound of freight trains moving somewhere far off, the kind of rhythm that makes you feel both safe and restless at once. She packed light, one camera bag, one roll of film, one cigarette half finished in the ashtray. Then she slipped her jacket on and locked the door behind her. It was Friday, November the 21st, 1998. She told her sister she had one more story to chase, something small, nothing dangerous. That was the last promise she ever broke. Downtown Memphis was alive that night, neon bleeding into puddles, horns echoing down South Main, the air thick with barbecue smoke and winter rain. Naomi walked fast, head down, camera clutched to her chest. She had been working on a series she called The Forgotten Corners, photographs of the places people used to care about before time and money moved on without them. She said the city spoke loudest where it had been left behind. At 9:15, witnesses saw her at the arcade diner near the train tracks, sitting alone at the counter with a notebook open beside her plate of cold fries. The waitress, a woman named Trina, said Naomi kept looking out the window like she was waiting for someone. When she finally stood, she left cash on the counter and said, "If he comes in, tell him I went to the river." No one ever asked who he was. From there, she walked toward the waterfront, past the empty warehouses and rusted loading cranes that looked like skeletons leaning over the water. A security camera from a pawn shop caught her at 9:41, moving quickly, hood up, camera bag on her shoulder. After that, the city swallowed her. Detective Lionel Drummond later said it was a quiet disappearance, the kind that does not make noise until it is too late. Her sister Lydia reported her missing 48 hours later, after finding Naomi's answering machine full of messages and her cat unfed. The police logged it as voluntary absence, the phrase they used when someone simply walked away. But Lydia knew better. Naomi never walked away from unfinished work. 3 days later, a jogger found her camera near Wolf River Harbor, half buried in mud, strap torn, water still trapped inside the lens. The roll of film was sent to the Memphis forensic lab, but the chemicals had eaten through the negatives, leaving only warped images, streaks of light, a woman's face blurred by motion, and in one frame, a cross-shaped reflection on water. Some said it was just damage. Others said it was a sign. Detective Sherry Vaughn took the lead on the case, her first as primary. She retraced Naomi's last known steps from the diner to the river and spoke with every musician who played that night, every cab driver, every drunk who might have seen her walk by. Nothing held. No struggle, no witness, no motive. Just a woman with a camera and a habit of walking too close to danger. By December, the 8-day search was scaled down. Flyers turned soft from rain. Names faded off the white paper, and the local paper stopped printing updates. The city moved on, the way cities always do, swallowing one more missing face into its noise. But there were things no one talked about then. Like how Naomi had been working on a private series about the church district, photographing old sanctuaries and the men who ran them. Or how one of her last rolls of film had been checked out by a pastor who said he wanted to use the photos for community outreach. His name was Reverend Silas Kincaid. At the time, he was untouchable, respected, married, soft-spoken, the kind of man no one would ever question. Detective Drummond wrote in his report that Naomi was likely a victim of opportunity, maybe a robbery gone wrong. He closed his notebook and called it chance. But what no one saw, or maybe no one wanted to, was that the last person Naomi ever photographed was standing less than 20 feet from the spot where her camera was found. And that frame, the one that never developed, was about to burn a hole through everything this city thought it knew about innocence. Naomi Hartwell's final night began like all the others, with the city humming below her window and the sound of freight trains moving somewhere far off, the kind of rhythm that makes you feel both safe and restless at once. She packed light: one camera bag, one roll of film, one cigarette half finished in the ashtray. Then she slipped her jacket on and locked the door behind her. It was Friday, November the 21st, 1998. She told her sister she had one more story to chase, something small, nothing dangerous. That was the last promise she ever broke. Downtown Memphis was alive that night, neon bleeding into puddles, horns echoing down South Main, the air thick with barbecue smoke and winter rain. Naomi walked fast, head down, camera clutched to her chest. She had been working on a series she called The Forgotten Corners, photographs of the places people used to care about before time and money moved on without them. She said the city spoke loudest where it had been left behind. At 9:15, witnesses saw her at the arcade diner near the train tracks, sitting alone at the counter with a notebook open beside her plate of cold fries. The waitress, a woman named Trina, said Naomi kept looking out the window like she was waiting for someone. When she finally stood, she left cash on the counter and said, "If he comes in, tell him I went to the river." No one ever asked who he was. From there, she walked toward the waterfront, past the empty warehouses and rusted loading cranes that looked like skeletons leaning over the water. A security camera from a pawn shop caught her at 9:41, moving quickly, hood up, camera bag on her shoulder. After that, the city swallowed her. Detective Lionel Drummond later said it was a quiet disappearance, the kind that does not make noise until it is too late. Her sister Lydia reported her missing 48 hours later, after finding Naomi's answering machine full of messages and her cat unfed. The police logged it as voluntary absence, the phrase they used when someone simply walked away. But Lydia knew better. Naomi never walked away from unfinished work. 3 days later, a jogger found her camera near Wolf River Harbor, half buried in mud, strap torn, water still trapped inside the lens. The roll of film was sent to the Memphis forensic lab, but the chemicals had eaten through the negatives, leaving only warped images, streaks of light, a woman's face blurred by motion, and in one frame, a cross-shaped reflection on water. Some said it was just damage. Others said it was a sign. Detective Sherry Vaughn took the lead on the case, her first as primary. She retraced Naomi's last known steps from the diner to the river, and spoke with every musician who played that night, every cab driver, every drunk who might have seen her walk by. Nothing held. No struggle, no witness, no motive. Just a woman with a camera and a habit of walking too close to danger. By December, the search was scaled down. Flyers turned soft from rain, names faded off the white paper, and the local paper stopped printing updates. The city moved on, the way cities always do, swallowing one more missing face into its noise. But there were things no one talked about then, like how Naomi had been working on a private series about the church district, photographing old sanctuaries and the men who ran them, or how one of her last rolls of film had been checked out by a pastor who said he wanted to use the photos for community outreach. His name was Reverend Silas Kincaid. At the time, he was untouchable, respected, married, soft-spoken, the kind of man no one would ever question. Detective Drummond wrote in his report that Naomi was likely a victim of opportunity, maybe a robbery gone wrong. He closed his notebook and called it chance. But what no one saw, or maybe no one wanted to, was that the last person Naomi ever photographed was standing less than 20 feet from the spot where her camera was found. And that frame, the one that never developed, was about to burn a hole through everything this city thought it knew about innocence. It was the kind of morning that feels hollow, when the city looks the same, but everything underneath it has shifted. The fog hung low over Wolf River Harbor, thick as smoke, and the fishermen who came early said they could barely see their own hands. One of them, a man named Earl Dobbins, was casting near the silos when his line caught on something that refused to move. He thought it was a branch, maybe a tire, until he pulled it close and saw the glint of metal through the weeds. It was a camera, black and cracked, heavy with mud. When he lifted it, the strap broke clean in half, and the sound it made hitting the rocks was sharp enough to make him step back. Earl was not the type to scare easily. He had seen bodies pulled from that river before, drunks, runaways, men who had lost their bets with fate. But this felt different. He wiped the lens with his sleeve and saw a name carved faintly into the leather, N. Hartwell. He called the police because that is what you do when something feels wrong and you do not want to carry it home. Detective Sherry Vaughn arrived first. She was still new to homicide, still believing the job was about answers instead of weight. The camera smelled like rust and silt, and when she tilted it, water leaked from the battery compartment. She placed it in a plastic bag and told Earl he had done the right thing. He said, "Ma'am, I just hope whoever it belonged to is not still down there." At the lab, technicians opened the camera under a white light. The roll of film inside was swollen and soft. They worked in silence, wearing gloves, the only sound the click of tools and the low hum of the dehumidifier. When they unspooled the film, most of it was black, eaten away by the river. But near the end were fragments of shapes, light, a wall, the curve of a face. Then something that looked like water glowing under a cross of reflection. They tried to clean it, to find an image, but the chemicals only made it worse. The pictures stayed ghosts. Meanwhile, Detective Lionel Drummond stood on the riverbank staring at the footprints in the mud. They led halfway down the slope, then stopped. No drag marks, no sign of struggle. Just two sets of prints side by side, as if whoever had been there stood waiting for something. He followed them until the river erased the rest. He lit a cigarette and told himself the footprints did not mean anything, but he wrote them down anyway. Two sets, one smaller, one larger. Back at the precinct, the report came in quiet. Camera recovered, property of Naomi Hartwell, contents unrecoverable. Case remains open. Drummond read it twice and felt nothing but the dull pressure that comes from knowing something important is just out of reach. He kept looking at the photo from her missing person file, the one with her half-smile, as if she knew the world would try to turn her into a story. That night, Lydia came to the station to collect her sister's belongings. She asked if the camera would tell them what happened. Vaughn hesitated before saying the film was damaged. Lydia pressed harder, asked if they could at least see what was left. The detective showed her the negatives, faint and warped, and Lydia stared for a long time before whispering that one of the shapes looked like a man's shoulder. She said Naomi had been taking pictures for a project about faith, about the places where belief cracked under pressure. She said Naomi told her some of those churches were not what they seemed. Vaughn took that note seriously, but when she mentioned it to Drummond, he told her to leave the churches out of it. Memphis was not a city that liked its gods questioned. The next morning, the river dropped an inch, revealing a piece of fabric tangled around a piling. It was blue, thin, and torn clean through. The divers went back in, but found nothing else. The river was finished talking for now. For the first time, the detectives began to think they were not chasing a disappearance at all. They were chasing a cleanup. And somewhere behind the sermons, the prayers, and the choir songs that floated across the city on Sunday mornings, someone already knew the truth. The river did not give up its dead easily. It held them close, wrapped in silt and memory, until it decided the silence had gone on long enough. That morning, on the 1st of March in 1999, the waterline dropped after a week without rain, and what had been hidden began to breathe again. A maintenance worker from the Port Authority was walking the edge of the dock when he saw something pale caught in the reeds. At first he thought it was driftwood, bleached by the current, but when the wind shifted, he saw hair moving under the surface like a thread of gold. He stepped closer and froze. The shape was wrong for wood. He backed away, called it in, and within an hour the river bank was lit with red and blue that bounced off the water like veins of fire. Detective Lionel Drummond stood at the tape line with a cup of coffee gone cold. He had seen bodies before, more than he cared to count, but this one felt different. It felt familiar. The divers moved slow, lifting the figure from the water with ropes, the plastic sheeting wrapped tight around it, glistening in the weak light. It was the same kind of tarp used for home renovations, thick and clear, edges sealed with duct tape. When they laid it on the embankment, the sound it made was soft, almost respectful. Drummond did not need the coroner to tell him who it was. The size, the hair, the torn blue fabric still caught in the plastic. Naomi Hartwell had come home. Detective Sherry Vaughn stood beside him, her notebook trembling in her hand. The coroner, Dr. Miriam Colson, knelt by the body and spoke quietly to her team, words meant for the living but heard by the dead. The bindings around the wrists were thin, strands of white cord knotted twice, the kind used in church choir robes. The plastic had been weighed with bricks, common, old, some with faded mortar still stuck to their edges. Whoever did it had not expected the river to change its mind. Drummond lit a cigarette and watched the current pull at the edges of the crime scene tape. "People say the river forgets," he said. "They lie." The evidence technicians moved fast, taking photographs, marking the footprints that trailed from the dock to the bank. There were at least 2 sets, one heavier, one lighter, both pressed deep into the mud. The heavier set matched the size of a man's work boot. The lighter ones stopped where the mud began to thin. The distance between them told its own story, a few feet apart, side by side, as if someone had been led there rather than dragged. By midday, the crowd had gathered. Reporters, dock workers, women from the nearby church who came to pray at the sight of it. Someone whispered the name Naomi, and the whisper grew until it was a low hum over the water. Vaughn turned her face away from the cameras. She knew what came next. The photos, the interviews, the questions that never brought peace, only noise. At the morgue, Dr. Coulson began the autopsy. The report would later read cause of death, asphyxiation due to water inhalation. But that was not the truth, not entirely. There was bruising on the back of her neck, faint but deliberate, the mark of a hand that had closed and not let go. The water had not killed Naomi Hartwell. Someone had. That night, Detective Vaughn sat in her car outside Grace Harbor Fellowship Church, the one Naomi had been photographing before she vanished. The lights were on, the windows glowing amber through the rain. Inside, a service was finishing, the congregation singing slow and low, their voices carrying through the open door. At the front stood Reverend Silas Kincaid, tall, calm, his hands folded as if he could hold the world together by prayer alone. Vaughn watched him step down from the pulpit and smile at the families leaving, his hand resting briefly on every shoulder. She wrote his name in her notebook, but did not draw a line under it. Not yet. The river had given back its secret, but the city was still holding its breath. The autopsy began at 7:45 on a gray Monday morning. The city outside was waking up slow, traffic murmuring beyond the windows of the Memphis Forensic Center. But inside the room it was only the sound of metal trays and latex gloves snapping into place. Dr. Miriam Coulson moved with the quiet precision of someone who had stopped believing in miracles, but still respected the dead enough to look for one. Naomi Hartwell lay under the light, her skin pale as paper, the water having taken the color from her. The river had been gentle, almost protective, but time never is. Her body showed signs of both surrender and struggle, a contradiction Dr. Coulson had learned to trust more than any witness. Detective Sherry Vaughn stood behind the glass, arms crossed, trying not to blink too often. She had been to dozens of autopsies since joining homicide, but this was the first that made her chest ache. Naomi was not a stranger anymore. She was a story that kept speaking. Dr. Coulson dictated each finding in her calm, detached voice. The lungs were waterlogged, the alveoli torn from pressure, consistent with drowning, but the bruising along the neck told a different story. It was shaped like fingers, 4 on one side, the thumb deep enough to leave an imprint against the muscle. A strangulation that stopped short, enough to knock her unconscious before she ever hit the water. Under the fingernails, there were traces of something hard, white and fibrous. At first, the lab thought it was paint, but under magnification, it looked like fabric, the same synthetic thread used in choir robes. On her wrist, the ligature marks were faint but clean, tied with precision, double-knotted. The tape sealing the plastic had been folded over neatly, no fingerprints left behind. Whoever did this was patient, organized, and unafraid of the quiet. Dr. Coulson looked up once, catching Detective Vaughn's reflection in the glass. "She did not drown by accident," she said softly. "Someone made sure she could not scream." Vaughn wrote those words in her notebook, then underlined them twice. By noon, the official report was typed, signed, and sealed. Cause of death: homicide by asphyxiation and subsequent submersion. Time of death: approximately late evening, November the 21st, 1998. The coroner noted the body had been preserved longer than expected for a river recovery, suggesting the water temperature and the tight seal of the plastic had slowed decay. Whoever wrapped her knew enough to buy time. Detective Lionel Drummond arrived late, coffee in one hand, coat still wet from the rain. He read the report without emotion, the way some men read obituaries. He said they needed to check the supply records for industrial plastic sheeting, construction companies, hardware stores. Vaughn nodded, already ahead of him. She had traced the cord from Naomi's wrists to a distributor that sold robes and altar linens to several churches across Shelby County. One of them was Grace Harbor Fellowship. That night, Vaughn and Drummond went back to the river. The floodlights were gone, the scene cleared, only a faint chalk marker left in the mud. The air smelled of diesel and wet wood. Vaughn stood where the body had been pulled from the water and asked out loud, "Why here?" Drummond did not answer. He just looked at the lights of the bridge reflecting on the black surface, shifting with the current like an unspoken truth. At the morgue, Dr. Coulson finished her notes and sealed the evidence samples. One of the threads found under Naomi's nails went to the lab for DNA testing. She labeled it Sample A146. Later, that number would be the one that broke the silence. But for now, all they had was a body, a broken camera, and a prayer that was starting to sound more like a warning. On Sunday morning, the city dressed itself in light. Church bells rolled through the air like distant thunder, and the smell of rain gave way to the scent of polished wood and perfume. Inside Grace Harbor Fellowship, every pew was filled. The choir sang slow and sweet, the kind of song that makes you believe forgiveness might still be possible. At the pulpit stood Reverend Silas Kincaid, hands raised, voice smooth as silk. He was 50 years old, but carried himself younger, the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he spoke. His sermons were never about fire and brimstone. They were about mercy, about letting go, about trusting what you could not see. People said he had a gift, that he could make you cry without remembering why. That morning, the congregation listened like it was the only truth left in the world. Detective Sherry Vaughn watched from the back, hidden behind a pillar. She had been there before, years earlier, for a friend's baptism, but now the room felt different. Too clean, too still, the kind of silence that hides something. Kincaid's voice rose and fell like a tide. "The river cleanses all things," he said, smiling at the front row. "But not all things deserve to be washed clean." The words hit her chest like a hand closing around a secret. She wrote them down. When the service ended, people swarmed around him, shaking his hand, asking for blessings. He called each of them by name, eyes soft, smile practiced. When Vaughn stepped forward, he did not flinch. "Detective," he said, as if they had already met. "You're here about that poor girl?" "Yes," she said, holding his gaze. "Naomi Hartwell." He nodded slowly, folding his hands together. "Tragic. She was a kind soul. Always taking pictures around the church. Said she wanted to capture the light." "Did you know her well?" Vaughn asked. "Well enough to see that she carried too much weight for someone so young," he said. "Sometimes when people go missing, it's because they lose sight of themselves. I pray she found peace." Vaughn's voice stayed even. "She was found in the river 2 days ago." For the briefest second, something passed over his face, a flicker, then gone. "Then I'll pray for her family," he said quietly, "and for whoever put her there." Outside, the congregation laughed and talked under the awning, their umbrellas blooming like dark flowers in the rain. Kincaid shook a few more hands, then disappeared into his office. Vaughn followed the hallway until she found the door. She knocked once. No answer. She turned the handle. Unlocked. The office was warm, lined with books, photographs, and framed Bible verses. On the wall behind the desk hung a collection of black and white prints. They were Naomi's work, each one signed with her name. They showed the church from different angles, the light filtering through stained glass, the river glinting behind it. But one photo stopped Vaughn cold. It showed the pulpit empty, and in the reflection of the cross, a figure stood in the doorway watching her. She pulled the photo closer. The outline was faint, but the shape was unmistakable. A man, tall, shoulders broad, head tilted as if caught mid-step. She heard a sound behind her, soft and deliberate. Kincaid was standing in the doorway. "Beautiful work, isn't it?" he said, smiling. She had an eye for truth. Vaughn turned slowly. "Did she give these to you?" "She left them here the last time she visited," he said. "Said she wanted to show them to me after she developed the negatives." Vaughn nodded, though every muscle in her body told her not to. "Do you mind if I borrow one?" He smiled wider. "Of course not. The truth belongs to everyone." She walked out into the rain, the photo tucked under her arm, her pulse still climbing. The image of the figure behind the pulpit stayed fixed in her mind, clear as light through stained glass. Back at her car, she placed the photo on the passenger seat and whispered to herself that the truth had a face now. She just needed the river to say his name out loud. The file sat on a metal shelf in the basement of the precinct, a thin folder swallowed by dust. The ink on Naomi Hartwell's name had begun to fade, the letters turning from black to gray, like even the paper was forgetting her. Cases like this did not end, they drifted. The city moved on, and silence did the rest. Detective Lionel Drummond retired 2 years later, his desk emptied, his badge left in a drawer. Detective Sherry Vaughn transferred to missing persons, though she never stopped carrying Naomi's photograph folded inside her notebook. Every now and then she would take it out, trace the lines of the face, and promise herself she would not let it be another unsolved ghost story. Lydia Hartwell stayed in Memphis. She kept her sister's camera on a shelf above her kitchen table, the lens cracked, the body rusting, but still aimed toward the window as if waiting for something to appear. She stopped going to church. She stopped taking pictures. She started writing letters instead, one every Sunday, addressed to Naomi, telling her about the weather, about how the river smelled different in summer, about how the world had kept turning without permission. The city forgot. New murders, new faces, new grief. The newspapers replaced Naomi's name with others, and even the pawn shop that once caught her last image closed its doors. The tape that had shown her walking into the fog was boxed away and later erased. Time was the perfect accomplice. Reverend Silas Kincaid kept preaching. He moved to a larger church, built a new congregation, his voice growing smoother, his reputation stronger. The photos Naomi had taken of Grace Harbor Fellowship were donated to the museum downtown as part of a local history exhibit. The caption read, "Light and Faith in the City." No one noticed that one of the prints was missing. Dr. Miriam Colson wrote 2 more reports that year, both drowning cases, both listed as accidental. She retired after that, but she kept a single note from Naomi's autopsy taped inside her journal. It said, "Hands tell the story when the mouth cannot." For 20 years, the case file slept. It survived a flood, a relocation, a system update that erased hundreds of old records but somehow left hers intact. The label on the spine read, Hartwell Naomi E. Homicide. Under it, in smaller print, someone had written, "Do not destroy." No one remembered who. In 2024, the Memphis Cold Case Unit was restructured, funded by a new federal grant that promised technology could do what faith had failed to. They brought in retired agents, forensic specialists, and volunteers. Among them was a man named Elias Monroe, a former profiler with eyes that looked like they had seen too much truth. He was assigned 20 old files to review. Naomi's was number 9. He opened it on a quiet afternoon. The air smelled of old paper and dust. The first thing he saw was her photo, the one from her missing person poster. He read the report twice, then looked up the address of Grace Harbor Fellowship. It was still standing, still active, still led by Reverend Silas Kincaid. Monroe closed the file, tapped it against the table once, and whispered, "The river never lies." That night, in the archives of the forensic lab, a young technician found a sealed envelope marked Sample A146. The label was yellowed, the tape brittle, but the contents had never been tested with modern methods. It was a small scrap of white fiber taken from beneath Naomi's fingernails 26 years earlier. When the technician ran the analysis, the computer hummed, lights blinking green across the screen. The machine compared the DNA embedded in the fibers to every sample in the national database. The result took less than 7 minutes. A name appeared, and with it, the silence that had lasted more than 2 decades began to crack open. The file came back to life on a Wednesday morning when the fluorescent lights in the cold case unit buzzed too loudly, and the rain pressed against the windows like it wanted to come in. Elias Monroe sat alone at his desk, the Hartwell folder open in front of him, the name printed in fading ink. The computer screen flickered with the lab report that had just arrived from Quantico. The words were simple but heavy enough to tilt the room. Partial DNA match confirmed. Source: Reverend Silas Kincaid. Monroe read it twice, then leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He had seen this before, the quiet unraveling of a lie that had held together for too long. It never came with shouting, only with the slow recognition that the truth had been there all along, waiting for someone stubborn enough to listen. He called Detective Cherie Vaughn, who had retired years earlier, but still answered on the first ring. When he told her the result, there was no silence, only a deep exhale that sounded like someone finally putting down a weight. "I knew it," she said. "I just could not prove it." They met that afternoon in the archives, where the smell of old paper mixed with mildew and coffee. Vaughn brought the photo Naomi had taken, the one with the reflection of a man in the pulpit. Under the new lights, the shape was clearer. A broad shoulder, a tilt of the head, a collar glinting with a crosspin. Monroe compared it with a recent photo of Kincaid taken from the church website. The same build, the same tilt of the head. Time had softened his face, but not erased it. They pulled his personnel file, his sermons, the church's financial records. The deeper they went, the darker it became. Payments to a small photography fund that Naomi had helped set up, labeled Community Outreach. Withdrawals in cash. No receipts. Vaughn found correspondence between Kincaid and Naomi dated only a week before she vanished. He had invited her to document an overnight service by the river. Monroe closed his eyes. He brought her there, he said. By evening, they had enough to request a warrant for a DNA sample. The district attorney hesitated at first, said the case was too old, that the evidence might not hold. But then Vaughn placed the photo on the desk and said, "The river waited 26 years. The law can wait one more day. The next morning, they drove to Grace Harbor Fellowship. The church looked unchanged. White paint peeling, a new sign out front, same name. Inside, the choir was rehearsing, voices rising in slow harmony. When they entered, Kincaid turned, surprise flickering across his face before he smiled. "Detectives," he said, his voice warm. "I was wondering when the past would knock." They explained the purpose of the visit. He agreed to provide the sample, calm as ever, even joking that it might finally clear his name. Vaughn watched his hands as he signed the consent form. They did not shake. That night, Monroe stayed in the lab until the lights dimmed and the machines whispered. The analysis took hours. He watched the data scroll across the screen, lines of code turning into numbers, numbers turning into truth. When the result came in, it was clean. Probability of match, 99.8%. The DNA found under Naomi Hartwell's fingernails belonged to Reverend Silas Kincaid. Monroe printed the report and laid it on the table beside her photograph. The paper trembled slightly in the air from the vent above, as if the room itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city was quiet, and in that quiet, something began to move again, the sound of justice waking from a very long sleep. The report reached Memphis just after dawn. The sky was colorless, the kind of pale gray that feels like the city is holding its breath. Elias Monroe sat in his car outside the precinct, the printed pages spread across the passenger seat. The DNA results were final. No questions, no doubt. The skin cells found beneath Naomi Hartwell's fingernails belonged to Reverend Silas Kincaid. He stared at the words until they blurred, the black ink bleeding into the white like the river bleeding into fog. 26 years of silence reduced to a single paragraph. He folded the report, slid it into an envelope, and carried it inside. The lieutenant looked up from his desk, reading Monroe's face before reading the paper. No one said congratulations. Some truths were too heavy for that. The order went out within the hour, a warrant for arrest. By noon, they drove toward a Grace Harbor Fellowship. The streets shimmered with heat rising from the asphalt, and the church bell rang once, echoing across the rooftops. Inside, a handful of people were gathered for a charity lunch. The moment Monroe stepped through the door, conversation stopped. Reverend Kincaid stood near the pulpit, sleeves rolled to his elbows, smiling the same practiced smile he had given for 25 years. "Agent Monroe," he said, as if greeting an old friend. "I hear you've been looking for ghosts." Monroe's voice stayed steady. "You know why we're here." "I imagine you think you've found something," Kincaid replied, still smiling, though his eyes had gone darker. Vaughn read the warrant aloud. The sound of the words filled the sanctuary, sharp and absolute. When she finished, Kincaid raised his hands slowly, palms outward. "Then let us pray," he said softly. They cuffed him as the choir fell silent. No resistance, no words, only the scrape of metal and the whisper of cloth as he lowered his head. Outside, reporters waited, cameras flashing, the questions already forming in the air. He walked between them without a glance, the picture of calm. At headquarters, Monroe watched through the glass as Kincaid sat at the interrogation table, still wearing his clerical collar. The man looked smaller now, stripped of his stage. Vaughn laid the photograph on the table, the one Naomi had taken, showing the figure in the reflection. "Do you remember this?" she asked. Kincaid looked at it for a long time, then said quietly, She had a good eye. Did you kill her? Monroe asked. He smiled faintly. The river did. Vaughn leaned forward. The river does not tie knots, Reverend. For a moment his mask slipped. The smile faded. His shoulders sagged. He whispered, You do not understand what light does to a man when it turns on him. When the tape stopped rolling, the silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. The confession never came in words, but in what he did not deny. The DNA had already spoken. It did not whisper. It screamed. That night, Monroe drove to the river. The water moved slow, dark, and endless, carrying the city's reflection like a secret it could not keep. He stood on the bank where Naomi's body had been found and thought about the word echo, how it means something that returns after being lost. The sound of the truth reaching back across time. He dropped a pebble into the current and watched the ripples fade. The water closed over it, still and perfect again. 26 years, one name, one truth that refused to stay buried. The echo had finally come home. The rain came back the night Reverend Silas Kincaid decided to speak. It was steady and unbroken, hitting the glass like quiet applause. The interview room was small, the walls sweating from the heat, the light above him buzzing faintly. He sat in his chair, hands folded neatly, cuffs glinting under the yellow light. On the table in front of him lay a Bible, a glass of water, and the photograph Naomi had taken of the pulpit. He kept looking at it, like he was waiting for it to blink. Elias Monroe pressed the record button. Detective Cherie Vaughn sat beside him, her notebook open, pen unmoving. Kincaid's voice came out soft, almost tired. You have already heard the story the way you needed it told, he said, but you have not heard it the way it happened. Monroe said nothing. He had learned that silence was the most powerful kind of question. Kincaid leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Naomi came to the church that evening. She was restless. Said she wanted to capture the light on the water before the storm came. I told her I was heading that way too, to pray for the river district. She smiled. Said I could keep her company. He paused, his voice catching slightly. She trusted me. He described walking with her down to the harbor, the air thick with humidity, the sky cut open by lightning in the distance. They talked about faith, about the city, about how she believed every broken place could be beautiful if you looked at it long enough. He said she took pictures while he watched the clouds roll in. Then she told me something, he said quietly. She said she had found proof that I was not who I pretended to be. She said she would publish it. Monroe's jaw tightened. Proof of what? Kincaid smiled faintly. Of my weakness. Of the people I hurt before I learned to speak the language of forgiveness. The rain outside grew heavier. He continued, voice low and even. I told her she was wrong, that God fixes broken men. She laughed. Not cruelly, just softly, like she pitied me. And I do not know what happened after that. I remember her face, the camera flash, the sound of thunder, and then my hands were on her shoulders. I told her to stop. She slipped, hit the car door. It was quick. Too quick. Vaughn whispered. And then... I panicked, he said. I thought if I could just make it look like she had gone to the water to take one last picture, it would end there. I wrapped her so she would not be found. I told myself it was mercy. His eyes glistened. I prayed over her before I let the river take her. I said her name 3 times. The room was silent except for the rain. Vaughn closed her notebook. Monroe reached forward and stopped the recorder. For a long time, Kincaid did not move. Then he whispered, I thought if I preached enough, the water would wash it clean. When they led him out of the station, reporters crowded the steps. He did not look at them. He did not look at the sky. He walked slowly, the cuffs hidden beneath his sleeves, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if he could already see the sermon he would never finish. Inside the evidence locker, Monroe filed the tape under Hartwell, Naomi. He stood there for a while, listening to the hum of the lights and the faint sound of thunder outside. The air felt lighter, but not clean. Justice had weight, too. Later that night, Vaughn drove back to the river. The rain had stopped, the surface smooth again. She threw a flower into the current, a white lily, and watched it drift until it disappeared into the dark. For the first time in 26 years, the water did not seem to be hiding anything. It was just water again. Memphis woke slowly that morning, as if the whole city had been holding its breath through the night. The radio spoke his name first, then the papers, then the people. Reverend Silas Kincaid, arrested for the murder of local photographer Naomi Hartwell. Case reopened after 26 years. The story moved through the streets like smoke, curling into coffee shops and churches, carried on whispers that sounded a lot like disbelief. At Grace Harbor Fellowship, the doors stayed locked. The sign out front still read, "All are welcome," but no one crossed the threshold. The choir stopped rehearsing. The pews stayed empty. For the first time in decades, the church fell silent. Some said the silence was shame. Others said it was mourning. Detective Sherry Vaughn sat in her car across the street, watching the rain trace lines down the windshield. She thought about Naomi, about the photograph that had started it all, about how light can sometimes reveal more than it was meant to. The photo still hung on her wall at home, framed between case notes and old evidence tags. She told herself she would take it down when she was ready, but she never did. Elias Monroe handed in his report and left the precinct that afternoon without ceremony. He drove to the river one last time, parking where the dock curved into the water. The current was slow, brown and heavy, catching the sunlight in thin silver threads. He thought about how long the river had kept its secret, and how patient truth can be. Sometimes justice does not roar. Sometimes it waits, quiet as silt, until someone stirs it. In a small apartment above a flower shop downtown, Lydia Hartwell sat at her kitchen table, the same camera on the shelf still aimed at the window. The phone rang until the machine picked up. The voice on the message said, "It is done." She did not cry. She simply reached for the notebook that had belonged to her sister and wrote one last letter. "You were right," she wrote. "Light always wins. It just takes time." Then she tore the page free and placed it under the camera. By evening, the sun broke through. The city looked different, washed clean but quieter. People passed the church on their way home from work without looking up, their eyes fixed on their phones, their thoughts somewhere safer. No one noticed the mural that had appeared overnight on the brick wall near the riverfront. It showed Naomi with her camera raised, a streak of gold cutting through the gray, her face turned toward the light. A child stopped and asked his mother who she was. The mother said she did not know, but that she looked kind. The child said, "Then she is probably still taking pictures." And maybe she was, because the river no longer whispered her name, it carried it. The river never kept her secret. It just waited for someone to listen. Naomi Hartwell's story began with a flash and ended with a silence that lasted more than 2 decades. It was not the cameras or the headlines that brought her justice. It was persistence, the stubborn kind that does not fade with time. Every name in every old file deserves that kind of patience. Somewhere tonight another case sits in a drawer, another photograph waits undeveloped, another family still looks at the door. The world moves on, but the river remembers. If stories like this matter to you, do not let them sink back into the dark. Leave a comment with what you think the truth really was, or what justice should have meant for Naomi. Like this video so her name stays in the algorithm that the world now listens to, and subscribe so you do not miss the next time silence decides to speak. Because every echo needs someone to hear it. And sometimes the smallest voice can bring the dead back into the light. This was Memphis, 1998. The Riverlight Case.